We will be in the book of 2 Chronicles. 2 Chronicles, chapter number 8. 2 Chronicles, chapter number 8. We have 4 chapters this morning, so the days of having just a few verses are over. We got to enjoy Galatians kind of piece by piece, but we are back to galloping our way through the Old Testament. We have 2 Chronicles 8 and 9, and then 1 Kings 10 and 11. Now, 2 Chronicles 9 and 1 Kings chapter number 10 are almost identical, so we'll go through them simultaneously. But chapter number 8 of 2 Chronicles is where we're going to start here, and then we'll work our way through the rest of it. In this chapter, we find some projects that Solomon is working on. He is a very wealthy king. He's a very busy king. And he is busy building all kinds of different places. And we see in chapter number 8 of 2 Chronicles, verse number 1 says, "And it came to pass at the end of 20 years, wherein Solomon had built the house of the Lord and his own house, that the cities which Hiram had restored to Solomon, Solomon built them and caused the children of Israel to dwell there." So we see listed in these next few verses, verses 1 through 6, we see several cities and several projects that Solomon is working on. We see Hamath Zobah and Tadmor, Hamath, Beth-horon, Baalath. He builds entire cities for his chariot people, the people that ride his chariots, his horsemen, these people. He builds entire cities for them. He has so many. We see he's building in Jerusalem, he's building in Lebanon, and at the end of verse number 6, we see, and throughout all the land of his dominion, he's building these different things. He's investing in infrastructure, he's investing in real estate, he's building up all of these places, and we're going to see just how much money he has to do this as we get into these further passages. Verses 7 and 8, we see that he puts the people of the land to tribute, not the Israelites, but the other people. They're paying tribute to this person. He's taxing the outsiders. Interesting strategy, huh? He's taxing the foreigners there. Verses 9 and 10, we see that he deals with the Israelites differently than everyone else. And he puts them more in management and military positions than in servitude positions. Then we get verse number 11. This is a very interesting verse. I want to read it, and we're going to come back to it later. "And Solomon brought up the daughter of Pharaoh out of the city of David unto the house that he had built for her. For he said, My wife shall not dwell in the house of David, king of Israel, because the places are holy, whereunto the ark of the Lord hath come." Interesting little verse there. Verses 12 through 16, we see Solomon sets up a worship program or kind of a schedule as far as making sure people are where they need to be. He sets up the Mosaic temple sacrifices in this temple that he has built. Notice what it says, verse number 12, "Then Solomon offered burnt offerings unto the Lord on the altar of the Lord, which he had built before the porch, even after a certain rate every day, offering according to the commandment of Moses." He has built the temple. They've moved from tabernacle sacrifices now into the temple, and Solomon makes sure that they do it the way that they're supposed to. That's what he's setting up there in verses 12 and 13, and then 14 and 15. We see that he's setting up the priests in the order that they need to be, and they're where they need to be. They know what they're supposed to do. And that brings us to verse number 16, where he completes the work of the temple from laying the foundation and building the house to actually making sure that it's in its operating order. Verses 17 and 18, we see the ships that Solomon has built. He kind of teams up here with Hiram, who's also known as Hiram, over in 1 Kings chapter 11 and 10 and 11. This is the same person, and they're building ships that are going to the place called Ophir. An interesting place. We're not really sure where that is. Estimates go all the way from Africa to India and Indonesia. So, in other words, we don't know where this is. But it was a place that had a lot of gold, and a place that had what is called like the best gold. It's the gold of Ophir. It's above the rest of the gold somehow or another. We see the amount of gold that's coming here. Look at verse number 18 at the end there. "And took thence 450 talents of gold and brought them to King Solomon." These talents, again, when we're talking about old weights and measures, we don't have a perfect translation to modern times. Estimates for how big one talent is range from, I've seen 60 pounds, I've seen 120 pounds. So if we're going to be very conservative and say 60 pounds, is 1 talent, then this 450 talents is 27,000 pounds of gold. It's a decent amount of gold, worth about $1.3 billion. So that's how much gold is coming to him here. And it was interesting as I'm studying all of these numbers and translating this gold to dollars today, after hearing all of the government cuts that are happening, it really doesn't sound like that much money. You're just hearing a lot of billions and a lot of, 500 billion, 400 billion, or 50 billion, however much. And so when you hear 1.3, you're like, that's not really a big deal. But when it's cold, hard cash and actual gold coming into your country, it's kind of a big deal. So $1.3 billion worth of gold here in verse number 18. That brings us to a discussion in chapter 9 of 2 Chronicles, which corresponds to 1 Kings chapter number 10. We've got a discussion of the prosperity that's happening in Solomon's reign. It's actually incredible when you look at the resources, the money, the power that Solomon has during his reign. It's pretty incredible as we get into it. We see in these first 2 verses of 2 Chronicles chapter 9, or actually the first 12 verses, summarizes the trip of the Queen of Sheba who comes to visit Solomon. Look at verse number 1. And when the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon, she came to prove Solomon with hard questions at Jerusalem, with a very great company and camels that bear spices and gold in abundance and precious stones. And when she was come to Solomon, she communed with him of all that was in her heart. And Solomon told her all her questions, and there was nothing hid from Solomon, which he told her not. She's coming with all of these goods, all of this stuff to give Solomon. And I read it on Wednesday night, but I like what 1 Kings 10 verse 1 says about this visit. It says, when the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord. What she was really interested in was how this corresponded to God. That's what really piqued her interest and caused her to make this journey. Now, how big of a journey was it that she made? The land of Sheba is in what would be modern day Yemen. And so if you take like straight line distance from Yemen to Jerusalem, it's about 1,200 miles, which I don't know if you've ever ridden a camel. They're not really good at like straight line distances. So it was probably longer than that. But if we say 1,200 miles, a camel that is loaded down can travel between 15 to 30 miles a day. So if we take the very optimistic estimate of 30 miles, we're talking 40 days that she traveled in perfect conditions one way. This is a 40-day journey, and I want you to think about, this is she's the Queen of Sheba. She has a kingdom to take care of. She has a whole nation to rule, and she's taking 40 days one way, 40 days back. It's probably a 120-day journey if you're realistic. This is a big deal. President Trump hasn't even been in office for 40 days yet, or for enough time to go there and back. That's how long we're talking about. She was just gone to see this Solomon. It's a big deal that she made this journey. Such a big deal that Jesus says in Matthew 12:42, the Queen of the South, referring to the Queen of Sheba, shall rise up in judgment with this generation and shall condemn it. For she came from the uttermost parts of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, a greater than Solomon is here. This was a big journey that she took to try to figure out what was going on in the kingdom of Solomon. We see in these next verses 3 through 8, the reaction that the queen has to all that she sees. She sees his servants, she sees his provision, she sees all of the wealth that he has, and she ends up with, in verse number 4 there at the end, there was no more spirit in her. She said to the king in verse 5, it was a true report which I heard. And then she goes on to say, I didn't believe them because I thought it was too good, but I figured out they actually weren't true. They weren't telling me the truth. It's even better than I thought. And I think it was General Patton that said, was it 90% of reports are exaggerated? This was the 10% that was not. This was understated, how incredible Solomon's kingdom was. And what she's really impressed with, look at this in verse number 7. I love this. It says, happy are thy men, and happy are these thy servants, which stand continually before thee, and hear thy wisdom. I guess that happy service was as rare back then as it is now. Nothing has really changed. She was amazed that they have servants that are happy. And we were out at the zoo yesterday, and just as we got there was a group that was leaving, and it was this guy that had a trumpet. Never met him before in my life. I don't really know his background or anything, but he's got a shirt on that says faith and stuff, and he knows the hymns. And so he started playing trumpet with us, and he's having a great time. He's clapping. He's just having a lot of fun, a lot of joy, a lot of happiness. And if you watch the people around there, they noticed it. They saw it. They saw that he was having a good time, and they enjoyed watching what he was doing. They enjoyed listening to what was going on because he had joy. And in a world where there's so little happiness and so many problems and distresses and things to be sad and weighed down about, if we can have joy, people notice. That's really what got the attention of this Queen of Sheba. She says everybody's happy. And I think that's something that we can work on. It's something that I can work on. Showing the joy of the Lord to people. Because it's something that they don't have. Nehemiah 8 verse 10 at the end says, "For the joy of the Lord is your strength." So we see her reaction to everything that's going on. Verses 9 through 12, we've got an exchange of goods. She gives him 120 talents of gold. That's about $345 million that she hands off to him before she makes her 40-day journey back home. We see in the next section here, 13 through 31, some more description of the riches of Solomon. What is coming in, what's going out, what he's doing with all that he has. Look at verse number 13. The weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold. That's 666 talents of gold. This is quite a bit of gold here. According to our previous calculations, you're talking about $1.92 billion worth of gold flowing through. That's just gold. That's not even all the gold that he gets. Look at verse 14. Beside that which chapmen and merchants brought in. Chapman is like kind of a traveling salesman. So all of his merchants and these people that are dealing his goods, they're bringing in even more than this. This isn't even counting the silver. It's not counting the apes. It's not counting the peacocks. It's not counting all of the stuff that we see later on that are coming into Solomon. Just the gold that comes into him is this 666 talents. I want you to see verses 15 and 16. He's making some targets in verse 15 and some shields in verse 16. And if you transfer these out, he's making 500 of them, 200 targets, 300 shields. A target is like a bigger shield. It's got twice as much gold as the shields, but these targets are worth about $576,000 each. And these shields are worth about $288,000 each. So this brings him to a defensive budget of $202 million for 500 shields. Sounds about like our budgets today, doesn't it? 500 shields, $202 million. Sounds like we're getting a good deal. Verse number 17 through 19, we see the throne that Solomon built. A very unique throne made out of ivory, overlaid with pure gold. There's 6 steps going up to it, lions on each side, a very incredible thing going on. Look at verse number 20. All the drinking vessels of King Solomon were of gold. All the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. And look what it says at the end. It was not anything accounted of in the days of Solomon. There was so much gold in Jerusalem at this time that they're like, should we make the cups of silver? They're like, why? Why not just make them gold? Like, it's no big deal. Just use gold for it. Forget about the silver. He goes on to say in verse number 27, the king made silver in Jerusalem as stones. You know how we use rock to like line a driveway or whatever? You want a garden, so you put some rock in there? They're like, yeah, just throw some silver in there. And I know that rock here is expensive, but in Jerusalem, it's not. There's rock everywhere. They built houses out of rock because it was more abundant than wood. And so this is saying like, they don't care about silver. It's no big deal. It shows you inflation is real. When there's wealth, when there's all of that stuff concentrating in one place, not many goods, a lot of money equals very high prices. That's just the way that economics works. So silver is just like rocks over in Jerusalem in the time of Solomon. We see he's got horses. We see the extent of his kingdom in verses 26 and 27. And then we see just the incredible wealth that he has. And it's all kind of summed up in verse number 22 here. It says, and King Solomon passed all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom. He's the top dog. He's the richest. He's the wisest. And he's got a great thing going. There's a great kingdom that he has built, a great economy, all kinds of good things happening in Israel. So we looked at Solomon's projects in 2 Chronicles 9, or 2 Chronicles 8. We looked at Solomon's prosperity in 2 Chronicles 9, but let's look now in 1 Kings chapter number 11. We looked at his prosperity. I want to look now at his problem. Because he's got a problem. And as I was looking at this, I thought about, I have a nephew that when he was 3 or 4, he had a really hard time saying the word lemon, and he would say, women. And he really liked lemons. Some of you can see where I'm going with this. And his mom was squeezing lemon into some water sometime. And he says, oh, what are you doing, Mom? And she said, oh, I'm putting lemon in my water. And he says, oh, I love women. I just love women. And if you look at Solomon, he had the same problem. Look at verse number 1. But King Solomon loved many strange women. I feel like Solomon would be perfectly at home in our modern society because there's plenty of them to go around. Plenty of strange people. Of course, when we say strange women, we're talking about foreign women. That's what this is referring to. We know that in the book of Proverbs, a strange woman refers a lot to harlots and prostitutes, but it seems that happened because a lot of those people in Israel, or most of them, were foreign, and so the words just kind of got connected. But we see that King Solomon loved many strange women. We see all of the nationalities that he loved. He loved the Moabites and Ammonites, Edomites, Zidonians, and Hittites. And just for a little gauge of what these people are like, these Zidonians, Jezebel, the wife of Ahab, was from Zidon. So that's who they're hanging out with, right? Not good people is what we're getting at. I know many of these marriages were likely for political reasons, but just look at the number of wives that he had collected. Verse number 3, he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. This is a lot. This is a big deal. You better have 666 talents of gold coming in if you're going to fund this operation. He was signing birthday cards quicker than President Trump signs executive orders. I'm talking this is a lot. I tried to put this in perspective of how much energy would this take to manage this household. If he wanted to dedicate 30 seconds, a generous 30 seconds each day to each wife, it would take him over 8 hours to do so. That's one after another. That's no lunch break. If he ate one meal with one of them every day and had 3 meals a day and never ate with one of them again until he had done all of it, it would take him 11 months. That's not with seeing one twice. This is pretty crazy. We see the number of wives. Then I want you to see what it produced in him. We see the number leads to the nagging. Look at verse number 4, or the end of verse 3. His wives turned away his heart. For it came to pass when Solomon was old that his wife turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. These women, he has so many of them with such bad intentions influencing him that it literally changes the direction of his heart. If you think one spouse is enough to fight with and to have problems with, imagine when that one leaves and the next one's got problems. It's incredible what Solomon was doing here. We see the gods that he ends up worshiping in verses 5 through 7. Ashtoreth, Milcom, Chemosh, Molech, all of these gods that are gods of the heathen. He was instructed, all Israel was instructed not to marry these people. God told them not to, but Solomon ignores this. He marries these women and he starts worshiping their gods. And that leads us to verses 9 through 13, where we see the Lord's anger as he reacts to what is going on in the life of Solomon. And the Lord was angry in verse 9 with Solomon because his heart was turned from the Lord God of Israel, which had appeared unto him twice and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods, but he kept not that which the Lord commanded. He broke the one rule that God laid down for him. We're going to get into this later. There's more that Solomon did wrong, but this is the one thing that God's like, this is a big deal. You worshiping other gods is a big deal, and because of that, he announces these consequences in verses 11 through 13. Wherefore the Lord said unto Solomon, for as much as this is done of thee, and thou hast not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded thee, I will surely rend the kingdom from thee, and will give it to thy servant. I'm going to take the throne away from you. He says, notwithstanding in thy days I will not do it, for David thy father's sake, but I will rend it out of the hand of thy son. Howbeit I will not rend all the kingdom, but will give one tribe to thy son for David my servant's sake. And here we see the introduction of what we're going to be dealing with for the rest of the book of Kings, which is a divided monarchy in the land of Israel, where we have Judah in the south and we've got the 10 tribes in the north. A divided kingdom ruled by 2 separate monarchs in 2 separate kingdoms. And those are the consequences for Solomon's actions. It wouldn't happen in his lifetime, it would happen in his son's lifetime, and he wouldn't take away everything, but he would take away 10 tribes. We see God also raises up some adversaries to Solomon. Look at verse 14. The Lord stirred up an adversary unto Solomon, Hadad the Edomite. He was of the king's seed in Edom. We see this Hadad in verses 14 through 22. His story is described. David sends Joab to go down to Edom to kill every male in Edom. Hadad flees as a child and ends up down in Egypt. Egypt takes care of him, raises him, gives him a wife, and he comes back to be in Edom and to hate Israel for all of the reign of Solomon. We see the next enemy in verses 23 through 25. Here we have Rezon, the son of Eliada, which fled from his lord Hadadezer, king of Zobah. He ends up in Syria, reigning in Damascus, and was an adversary all the days of Solomon. And then we see his last adversary, verses 26 through 40, which is Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. We're going to see this guy come back into play in 1 Kings chapter 12, the very next chapter. He's going to be the king of this divided kingdom up north. He's going to take those 10 tribes. We see Ahijah prophesies this to him. In verse number 30, Ahijah caught the new garment that was on him and rent it in 12 pieces. And he said to Jeroboam, take thee 10 pieces, for thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, behold, I will rend the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, and will give 10 tribes to thee. The reaction that Solomon has to this is in verse number 40. Solomon sought therefore to kill Jeroboam, and Jeroboam arose and fled into Egypt unto Shishak, king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. Solomon, of course, does not like this person who's going to take his king's throne, tries to destroy him. He flees. Egypt, once again, is a sanctuary for the enemies of Solomon. And we see in these last 3 verses, 41 through 43, the reign of Solomon comes to an end. He reigns for 40 years, an incredible reign of wealth, a incredible reign of power, of influence, resources. But we see it ends on quite a sad note with a prophecy of destruction for the next generation. So now that we have an overview of the life of Solomon or what happens in these chapters, I want to make some application of what we can gather from this and how it can help us in the modern day. What I think is so interesting about Solomon's situation is that we know he was a wise man. We know he had wisdom from God that was world-renowned. There were people that would travel great lengths, that would spend incredible amounts to come and hear his wisdom. Yet this man destroys his life with these women. And I want to title this lesson, When Wise Men Fall. Because we find here that the wisest man in the Bible falls. And as we break down the cause of it, we start with verse number 1 in chapter 11. And that's these foreign women. King Solomon loved many strange women. Now it's interesting, if we look back in Deuteronomy chapter 17, there's 3 specific rules that God gives to a king. There was no king in Israel, but he said, when you're going to have one, these are 3 important things that they need to be careful of. He says in Deuteronomy 17, verse 16, he shall not multiply horses to himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt, to the end that he should multiply horses. For as much as the Lord has said unto you, ye shall henceforth return no more that way. Neither shall he multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away. Neither shall he greatly multiply to himself silver and gold. Now we know that Solomon did all 3 of these things. I think we can probably give him a pass on the gold because God made him rich. But he multiplies horses, he multiplies wives, and he greatly multiplies silver and gold. And though I was looking at this and thinking about how it's 666 talents of gold, and if you're into numerology, that's a bad number, and surely it was the gold that destroyed him, but it wasn't. I guess he was wise enough to deal with gold. He was wise enough to deal with horses. It wasn't a problem for his reign, but when he disobeyed all 3 of the things, one of them got him. What God rebukes him for is not multiplying wives. It's not multiplying gold. It's not multiplying the horses. What he gets him for is what happened because he multiplied wives. It was the very thing God warned him of. He said, neither shall he multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away. And what does it say? He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. By breaking God's 3 rules, it led him to breaking the one rule that was most important, and that's he ended up worshiping other gods. And we move from these foreign women to Solomon's fruitless wisdom. Because he was very wise, and he knew better, but it didn't stop him. When you conduct a study through the book of Proverbs, which is written by Solomon, you find over and over explicit warnings against strange women. He says in Proverbs 2:16, to deliver thee from the strange woman, even from the stranger which flattereth with her words. Can you imagine with 1,000 wives and the competition going on, how many flattering words Solomon heard? He was an expert on this. He knew what flattering was. Proverbs 5, 3 and 4 says, for the lips of a strange woman drop as an honeycomb, and her mouth is smoother than oil, but her end is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. He has more to say in Proverbs 6:24, more to say in Proverbs 7:5. He says in Proverbs 23:27, for a whore is a deep ditch, and a strange woman is a narrow pit. Solomon knew that these women were dangerous. He knew the problems that could arise. He knew the difficulties he would face, but he just loved them. He did it anyways. And it gets crazier. We read the verse earlier, 2 Chronicles 8, verse 11. Solomon brought up the daughter of Pharaoh out of the city of David unto the house that he had built for her. For he said, my wife shall not dwell in the house of David, king of Israel, because the places are holy, whereunto the ark of the Lord hath come. Hey, honey, you can't live here anymore, because these places are holy and you're not. He knows there's a problem with what's going on. He knows that these women are different. He knows that they do not belong. He knows the danger of them leading him astray, but he does not care. He goes ahead and does it anyways. He was embarrassed to bring this woman to the house of God. And just on a side note here, if you're considering marrying somebody, but you're too embarrassed to bring them to church, maybe it's not a good situation. Maybe you should kind of think about it. But what I see here in Solomon's life is knowing better doesn't exempt you from the possibility of making big mistakes. Some of us have grown up in church or have been here long enough to know what's right and what's wrong. We know the dangers that can happen if we sin, if we do what God has told us not to do. And I think some of us get so comfortable that we feel like we're exempt from the danger because we know better. We know where this is going to lead. We know the problems that arise from this. We know that there can be struggles, and we just get to the place that we think this could not happen to us. It wouldn't happen to me. I know better. I grew up here. Don't preach to me. Don't tell me all of the dangers. I'm smarter than that. Maybe Solomon thought he was smarter. All of you stupid people, stay away from the strange women. I'm smart enough, I can deal with it. There's a lot of people that have that attitude. A lot of church kids that have that attitude. Yeah, but I've watched a lot of people go through it, and they just made dumb mistakes. Solomon, the wisest man in history, couldn't handle the strange women. He couldn't handle the sin that he preached against, but partook in himself. Solomon had great knowledge and great wisdom from God, but neither of those things kept him from falling down the slippery slope that he warned so many others about. And 1 Corinthians 10 verse 12 says, wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed, lest he fall. And Solomon stands as a warning to us today that none of us are exempt from the dangers of sin. None of us are exempt from the wiles of the devil. All of us can, even if we know better, even if we've watched so many people make the same mistake, even if we've seen this turn out wrong before, we'll get in our minds that we're smarter. We'll get in our minds that it won't happen to us. We'll get in our minds that we know how to avoid the pitfalls. We can have the fun without having the danger. We can have all of this stuff. The world thinks if we can educate our children, then they won't get diseases. If we can teach them better, then they'll just know that that's too dangerous and it's a bad idea. How's that working out? Not so well. What's ridiculous about man is in all our wisdom, we don't realize that we're doing things we know cause problems. You're never exempt from the possibility of great mistakes, even if you're as wise as Solomon. So we see that he knew better, but he did it anyways. And then I want you to see that he undid what others had done. He marries women of the people of Edom. He marries these Edomites. Now, we talked about how Joab remained in Edom, killing all of these males of Edom. So David fights all these battles to subdue the Edomites, and then Solomon tries to make peace with them. David risks his life, risks his men's lives to try to eradicate this enemy of Israel. And Solomon says, I don't need to fight him. I'll just sign a treaty with him. I'll just make a deal with him. And then we're going to be fine. I think this is a tragedy that we see so many second and third generation Christians make, where they look at the things that their parents fought so hard for and decide, we don't need to fight them. Let's just make peace. Let's just sign a treaty. Let's just compromise a little bit. I think often we don't understand the battles that previous generations went through to reach the place that they are now. We don't know what they fought to get the stand that they're in. And I think us young preachers do it a lot, where we look at older preachers and say, yeah, we can see that they were successful. You know, they have a church with a few hundred people, but we know what they did wrong. We know what they should have done different. If they would have done this, they'd be running 500, us in our 20s. So smart. We have no idea the battles that they went through to achieve what they have achieved. We don't know the wolves that showed up in their congregations and tried to destroy them. So when we say, they shouldn't preach that, or they should preach this, they shouldn't worry about that, they should be worrying about this, we have no idea. And I think Solomon didn't understand the danger of the Edomites. He didn't understand the dangers that he was playing with when he was marrying these women. He just thought, we can have peace, we don't have to fight. This is a great idea. Whereas Solomon leaves Joab there for 6 months to kill all the males in Edom. And even while Solomon is marrying these Edomites, trying to make peace with them, what happens? One of his greatest enemies is an Edomite. There's no making peace with the enemy. And he undoes what his father did. And I understand that there's some people that are fanatics and we don't need to do everything that they did. I get that. But I think we should be far more cautious and prayerful than we are before we go throwing away the things that previous generations preached with such tenacity and with such conviction. I think we should at least ask God, do you care about that? Do you think that's important? Maybe we should have a serious conversation with these preachers rather than making fun of them. Maybe we should ask them, why are you so adamant about this? What dangers do you see? But we don't. We say that's ridiculous. The modern day doesn't care about that. We don't need to worry about that. Why don't we just marry the Edomite? Then we have peace and there's no problems. That's the decision that Solomon made. And it cost him. Solomon maybe thought he had to marry these people to have peace, but did you know that God promised him peace? He tells David, behold, a son shall be born to thee, who shall be a man of rest, and I will give him rest from all his enemies round about. God promised the rest. But Solomon goes around saying, if I just marry this person, if I marry this person, if I make this alliance and sign this treaty, then it's all going to be okay. But that was the downfall of Solomon. What caused Solomon's enemies? It wasn't God. God would have protected him from the enemies. But he created the enemies in his attempt to get the peace that he thought he had to maintain. We see all the problems that he has. We see his fruitless wisdom. He knew better. He undid what his dad did. And that leads to his faithless ways. Solomon's heart was turned by his wives. It's really interesting when you think about what happened to Solomon. And when you look at this, the verbiage that it used, his heart was turned. I think what this is saying, in Solomon's heart, he didn't see anything wrong with doing what he was doing. His heart was turned. It was turned toward these gods. And I think really deep inside, Solomon didn't see any problem with worshiping these gods. He could say, my heart is clean. My heart is honest in what I'm doing. I don't see anything wrong with it. I don't think there's a problem here. And this is somebody, think about the life of Solomon. This is somebody who dedicated years of his life to building a temple for the one true God. He had 2 personal encounters with God. God says that he showed up unto him twice. He requested and received, personally experienced God's wisdom. He watched it flow through him. He watched it make Israel successful. He had seen the temple so full of God's very presence that people could not minister in the temple. And this is the person that later in his life looks around and says, I just don't see anything wrong with building these high places to these other gods. What's the big deal? And that to me is terrifying. It's terrifying that somebody can go from such dedication to God and such a good education, such a good upbringing, knowing the ways of God, and can be transferred to not even knowing the difference between right and wrong. And we're back to, we think we know better, but when you hang around 1,000 strange women, crazy stuff happens. And I believe Solomon's very heart was changed, and he just couldn't see anything wrong with it. He wasn't worried about it. It didn't bother him. It's not like he was like, yeah, I know this is wrong, but like my wives want to do it, and so it's okay. His heart was turned. He was literally like, sure. I think it's a good idea. That's wild. That's crazy. And Solomon puts it well in Proverbs 4:23 when he says, keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. And this is why it's so important to marry the right person and to have the right voices in those that are closest to you, because they really can change the direction of your heart. And you may say, yes, I'm talking to this person and we're thinking about getting married. And I know they're not spiritual, but they said, she says she's willing to change for me. Or he says he's willing to change. And I will say, sometimes that works out. I mean, maybe every once in a while. But even if they are willing, do you have enough energy and enough strength to teach them how to change? For me, I wanted to marry a wife. I didn't want to train a wife. Some of you may be into all that wife training stuff or something, but I want to be in it together. I want to serve God together. I don't want to have to train them how to do right. And Solomon, I think he just got tired of fighting all 1,000 women. He got tired of it. And before you know it, it changed his very heart. His heart was different. He had battle after battle on his hands because he loved these women, and he let them change him. That's why he says to keep thy heart with all diligence. And the problems that Solomon had, they lead us to the fearful woes at the end of his life. We see these enemies that arise. We see these problems that come up. The first one we see is Hadad the Edomite. There in verse number 14. And we gave you a little bit of his story. David's purging Edom. Job is there killing everybody. He runs down to Egypt. Now remember, Solomon marries the daughter of Pharaoh, right? So he's cutting a deal with Egypt. Over and over we see Egypt harboring Solomon's enemies. I will say that Shishak at the end is a different king than Solomon's father-in-law. There's a changeover in dynasties in Egypt, and so that's a little bit different, but this first one is likely the same one that was Solomon's father-in-law. And Egypt is harboring Solomon's enemies. What this shows me is that we can try to sign deals with the world, which Egypt is a type of the world. We can try to sign treaties with them. We can try to appease them. We can try to compromise. We can try to cut deals so that we don't have to fight. But they're still going to be harboring our enemies. They don't care about you. They don't like you. They don't even want to see you be successful. Solomon tried to make these deals. And did you know you can try to make friends with the world and perhaps sign treaties with them, but they'll never stop being your enemies. I think of Neville Chamberlain in the speech that he made after returning from negotiating a peace treaty with Adolf Hitler in September of 1938. Upon returning to England, he holds up the treaty and says, "My good friends, for the second time in our history, a British prime minister has returned from Germany, bringing peace with honor." And then he said the famous lines, "I believe it is peace for our time." Less than a year later, Adolf Hitler was invading Poland and starting the infamous World War II. He tried to make a deal, but the enemy didn't care about him. And we can try to sign deals with Egypt. We can try to say, oh, if you just stay over here, then I'll stay over here. Or we can say, why don't we just join together and be one people? How about we just don't worry about it? How about we just imagine there's no differences? How about we just pretend that everything's going to be okay? And they're like, yeah, we got you. And they got a load of enemies that they're like, come on to Egypt. Solomon doesn't like you, no big deal. Come down to Egypt. You can't make peace with the world and expect to come out without scars. Hadad the Edomite, we see Rezon the son of Eliada. And I want you to notice also Jeroboam the son of Nebat. And this is very interesting as we get into Solomon's reaction to Jeroboam. Now, I just want you to think about this. Jeroboam gets told by Ahijah that he's going to be the next king. Solomon hates Jeroboam. Now, is it Jeroboam's fault that he's going to be the next king? No. Whose fault is it that it's not going to be Rehoboam, Solomon's son? It's Solomon's fault. But Solomon takes it out on Jeroboam. Solomon wants to kill Jeroboam because his sin led to Jeroboam being the next king. Jeroboam was a reminder of the consequences of Solomon's sin. And instead of getting right, Solomon wanted to remove that reminder. He would rather destroy the will of God in Jeroboam's life than face the consequences of his own sin. And you see so many people who try to hinder God's work in other people's lives because they feel like that's what I should be doing. I don't want to do right, but you shouldn't do what I was supposed to do in the church. You watch somebody get out of the will of God and like they were doing stuff in the church and then they stop because like they're not at church anymore. And then the next person that takes their place, they hate their guts. They do everything wrong. And Jeroboam, it wasn't his fault. He was just following the will of God. He was just being Jeroboam. He was industrious. Solomon liked him until he figured out he was going to be the next king. But Solomon would rather destroy the will of God in this young man's life than have to face the consequences of his own sin. And then we see the consequences of Solomon's sin don't end with the enemies. Largely, Solomon's reign was known for peace. Even though he had these enemies. But the real payment for Solomon's sin fell not on him, but on his children. And this is what I think is so tragic about this situation. Rehoboam is the one that takes the brunt of Solomon's sin. He doesn't get to reign over all of Israel because of the decisions of his father. Rehoboam does make some bad decisions. I'm sure we're about to hear about that, where he listens to the young men, not the old men. But I don't really think that was Rehoboam's fault, because it was in fulfillment of God's prophecy. I mean, maybe God used Rehoboam's stupidity, but still, it was going to happen one way or another because of Solomon's actions. And my wife's pregnant, and we're supposed to have a baby in September. And as we head toward that, this stuff really weighs on my mind. Because this little person that we're bringing into the world may end up paying the price for some of my actions. And the decisions that I make, the choices that I make, might decide the direction that their life heads. And that's very sobering. I bet Solomon wished that the consequences could have fallen on him as he was dying, and knowing his son would have all of this heartache. Knowing his son would have all of these problems. But Solomon's actions fell on his son. There are always other people that are affected by our actions. Then I want you also to notice as we're closing, Solomon builds this high place for Chemosh and for Molech. Now, this god Molech was known for one thing specifically in its sacrifice services, and that was child sacrifice. And as Solomon is building these things for his wives, I can't help but think it was likely that his own children were sacrificed to these gods. And that's pretty crazy. I think that in our modern day, we look at this and say it's so ridiculous. There's no way that would happen today. I can't believe how crazy these people were that they would sacrifice their children. Yet all around we see people that make sacrifices for them, like they make family sacrifices to serve their own interests. We watch guys that neglect their family to play video games. We watch people that work instead of spending time with family. And I know you got to work. I know there's a balance to all of that. But we see people that blow this stuff away and end up 20 years down the road and don't even know their own kids. And I don't think that's any different than child sacrifice. Sure, you're not burning them to a god, but you still have no relationship with them. You're still offering them up for what your will is. And the consequences of Solomon's sin fell largely on his children. So as we close the message today and reflect on the problems of Solomon, can you at least hear the warning that Solomon's story gives us? Can you realize the dangers that are out there? This happened to someone far wiser than you and I. Happened to somebody that knew way more than we do. It happened to somebody that was the wisest man that ever lived. And if we're going to avoid this tragedy that Solomon faced, we can't put our hope in our wisdom or in our riches. The only thing that we can trust in, the only thing we can put our hope in, is the God that Solomon forsook. And if we're going to make it, if our children are going to have a chance in this world, we're going to have to put ourselves aside, and we're going to have to do what Solomon didn't do, and that's seek the Lord with all our hearts. We have to let the Lord keep our hearts. We have to walk in His way. We have to follow His leading. And we cannot forsake the way that Solomon looked on so lightly. Heavenly Father, Lord, I thank you for the lesson of Solomon. And though it was a tragedy, Lord, I pray that you would help us to learn something from it. I pray that you would help us not to make the mistakes that he made. Let us not put our faith in our own wisdom or in what we understand, Lord, but let us seek you and trust you to give us that wisdom day by day and help us to walk in the steps that you lay before us. In Jesus' name, amen.